My name is Sylvie Hartman, and at 58 I had reached the age where I thought life had already shown me its worst. The late-night phone calls, the empty side of the bed, the slow work of rebuilding after loss. I was a widow, a mother of one, and the quiet owner of a small upholstery workshop in a town most people only ever pass through. I'm telling you this now, from the other side of it, because I want you to understand who I was before any of it happened. Not bitter, not suspicious. Just a woman who believed the worst was already behind her. I didn't yet know that the most quietly cruel thing a person can do to you isn't to raise their voice. It's to seat you in the back of a room you paid for, and then hand you the bill on your way out. For most of my life, I measured my days in fabric and thread. When my husband Tom died, he left me a workshop the size of a two-car garage and a daughter who still slept with the hallway light on. I could have sold it. Instead, I learned every part of the business he'd loved. The stitching, the invoices, the long handshakes with suppliers who didn't expect a woman to know her own margins. Over 20 years, that little shop grew into something steady. I paid off the lake house. I set money aside in a trust the way Tom had taught me. Quietly, without ceremony, and I gave to my daughter Kala, the way water gives to a garden constantly, invisibly, never once asking her to notice. I believed love wasn't supposed to keep receipts. I believed the people you raise will always remember who carried them. That belief is exactly what other people would one day learn to use against me. Let me step out of the story for just a second, because I have a feeling some of you already know where this is heading. Wherever you're listening from tonight, in your kitchen, on a long drive, lying awake the way I used to. I'd love to know something. Has someone you gave everything to ever made you feel optional? If you've lived through a moment where your kindness got mistaken for a debt you owed, tell me about it in the comments. I read them, every one, and I promise you're not alone in it. And if these stories settle into your chest the way they settle into mine, maybe quietly subscribe, not for my sake, but so the next person who needs to hear this finds their way here too. Alright, let me take you back to where it started. It started with a phone call on an ordinary Tuesday. Kala's voice came through bright and breathless, the way it used to when she was small and had won something at school. "Mom," she said, asked me. "We're getting married." His name was Spencer Aldridge, and I knew the name before I ever knew the man, because everyone in our part of the state knew the Aldridges. Old family, old money, or at least the appearance of it. The kind of name that opened doors and ended conversations. And I was happy. Genuinely, fully happy. My daughter was in love, and after everything the two of us had survived, I wanted nothing more than to watch her stand somewhere beautiful and be celebrated. The first dinner was at the Aldridge home, a house with more rooms than reasons. Spencer's mother, Vivienne, met me at the door with a smile so practiced it could have been ironed. She told me what a lovely surprise it was that Kala came from such an interesting little background. And she said it the way you'd compliment a coat you'd never actually wear. I smiled back. I've spent 30 years reading rooms full of clients who assume a polite woman isn't paying attention. I was paying attention. By dessert, I could already see the shape of things. The Aldridges spoke about the wedding as though it were a public event. A statement, a brochure for whoever they wanted the world to believe they were. Kala glowed in the middle of it all, and I understood something that made my chest tighten. She didn't just want to marry Spencer. She wanted to belong to them. So I did what I have always done. I made it easy. Before we left that night, I quietly offered to underwrite the whole wedding. The venue. The vendors. All of it. So my daughter would never have to stand among those people feeling like she'd arrived with empty hands. Vivian's eyes brightened at that. I told myself it was gratitude. On the drive home, my sister Maeve called to ask how it went. I told her it went beautifully, and it had. But there was a thread of something underneath it that I couldn't name yet. The way you sometimes feel a seam begin to give long before you see it tear. I told myself I was just tired. I told myself rich people are simply like that. I told myself a great many things that year, and nearly all of them were ways of not looking directly at what I already knew. The first thing I noticed was how easily I disappeared from a wedding I was paying for. The planner's name was Danny, meticulous, kind, the sort of woman who color codes her worries. At our first meeting she slid the master contract across the table to me, along with the deposit checks, and every one of them needed my name and my signature, because every dollar was coming from me. I signed without hesitation. But I noticed, Even then, that whenever a real decision arose, the flowers, the Lennons, the music, the conversation drifted past me and landed on Vivian, as though I were the bank and she were the bride's mother. Once, when I suggested the garden roses Kala had loved as a child, Vivian laughed softly and called my taste sweet but a little simple. I let it go. I let a great deal go that spring. But I also began to notice that the contracts told a different story than the room did. On paper, every promise was mine to keep. The guest list was where the editing turned honest. Vivian reorganized it into tiers: donors and associates and people who mattered to the family, near the front and somewhere far below them, the relatives who had actually raised Kala, my sister, Maeve, the woman who'd driven through a snowstorm the night Kala was born, nearly didn't make the cut. When I gently said so, Kala sided with Vivian without even looking up. "It's just optics, Mom," she said, as if optics were a law of nature. I nodded and said nothing more. But something in me went quiet and watchful in a way it hadn't been in years. The same stillness I get before I take apart a chair to see what's gone wrong inside it. I stopped arguing. I started cataloging. Who was being protected? Who was being trimmed? Maeve saw it before I let myself. We met for coffee a week later, and she set her cup down and looked at me the way only a sister can. "Sylvie," she said, "those people are spending like money they don't actually have. And they're sanding Kala down to fit their shelf." I defended my daughter. Of course I did. I said she was happy, that I wouldn't begrudge her that. Maeve just shook her head and told me to stop signing blank generosity before it cost me more than money. I went home a little annoyed with her. But that night, alone at the kitchen table, I pulled out the contracts again and read them slowly, the way Tom taught me to read anything that involved a signature. And buried in the Aldridges' contribution agreement there was a clause I had skimmed past the first time. A single paragraph I suddenly couldn't stop rereading. It took me until nearly 2 in the morning to understand what I was looking at. The Aldridges' celebrated contribution. The generous sum Vivian mentioned at every dinner. The money that supposedly proved their commitment. Wasn't a gift at all. It was structured as a short-term loan to be repaid by the couple after the wedding, with quiet conditions ensuring the Aldridge name appeared on every vendor credit, every announcement, every framed photograph of the day. My money, by contrast, was simply gone, given outright, final, asking nothing back. They had arranged to look generous while I was arranged to be generous. I sat with that for a long while, the house ticking around me. I didn't call anyone. I didn't confront a soul. I simply made copies of everything, dated them, and put them in the same drawer where I kept Tom's old ledgers. Then I made myself a decision that surprised me with how calm it felt. I would keep paying. I would let the wedding go forward exactly as my daughter wanted it. But I was done giving blindly. From that night on, I started keeping receipts again. Every contract, every transfer, every promise made in writing. The way I had in the early years, when I was a widow, learning that the world will take precisely as much as you let it, and call you difficult the moment you stop. What I didn't know yet was that the cataloging wasn't the test. The real one was still 2 weeks away, waiting for me in a folding chair at the rehearsal, with a little card that had my name on it, and a number I never expected to see. The rehearsal was held at the venue itself, a restored heritage estate with a garden that looked like something out of a painting, the kind of place I had quietly written checks for without ever once being asked which corner of it I liked best. I arrived early, the way I always do, and that was how I found the seating chart before anyone could arrange my face for me. The entire front row had been reserved for the Aldridges and their associates. Names on little cream cards and a calligraphy I had paid for. I scanned for mine. I found it in row 9, near the back, tucked between a business contact of Spencer's father and someone I'd never met. For a moment I simply stood there, holding the card, reading my own name as though it belonged to a stranger. When Vivian glided over, she explained it before I could ask. It was balance for the cameras, she said. The Aldridge side carried the family's public image, and the front needed to photograph as a unit. Calla stood a few feet away and did not meet my eyes. My stomach dropped clean through the floor. But my face, 30 years of difficult clients had taught it well, never moved. I waited until I could speak to Calla alone, near the rose arch I hadn't been allowed to choose. I didn't raise my voice. I just told her I wanted to understand. And my daughter, using words that were so clearly not her own, said the front row was for the family that built something. She said I was being dramatic. she said with a small, tired sigh. Mom, it's just where you sit. I have been spoken to harshly in my life. I have been underestimated and dismissed, and called difficult by men who didn't like being corrected. But I am not sure anything ever landed the way those 6 words did. It's just where you sit? Because they weren't really about a chair. They were a verdict on my whole quiet life, on every invisible thing I had given so that she would never have to feel small. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said only, "All right." And I chose, deliberately, to watch instead of argue. Because arguing is loud, and I have always done my best work in the quiet. I wasn't the only one who saw it. Maeve had come along to help with the favors, and she went pale, and then furious in the space of a breath. I caught her arm before she could march across that garden and say something true and unforgivable. Danny saw it too. She found me by the catering tent afterward, twisting her clipboard, and said carefully, almost as a question, that she just wanted to make sure I knew every vendor relationship for the day was contracted to me. The florist, the caterer, the estate itself. She didn't say more than that. She didn't have to. I thanked her, and I asked them both, gently, to do nothing. Not yet. Maeve thought I was surrendering. I wasn't. I was simply confirming where I stood, who answered to whom, whose name was on every line that actually held this day together. There is a difference between accepting a slight and accounting for one, and I had spent 2 weeks already learning to tell them apart. The picture went up that night. Someone had taken a photo at the rehearsal. The Aldridges clustered at the center of that beautiful garden, beaming, radiant, captioned with something about the family coming together. I was at the very edge of the frame, half crop, a blur of someone who happened to be standing there. The comments rolled in beneath it, strangers praising the Aldridge legacy, the elegance, the pedigree. I looked at it for a long time. And then I did something that surprised me. I saved it. Not in anger. I was past anger by then, into something steadier and colder and far more useful. I saved it the way you save a document, because that photograph was no longer just a slight. It was a public claim. It was the Aldridges telling the world, in writing, exactly whose day this was and exactly who didn't belong in the center of it. I slept soundly that night, better than I had in weeks, because the not knowing was finally over. They had shown me precisely what they thought I was worth. 2 days later, my daughter handed me an envelope. And inside it was the number that turned all of my quiet watching into something with a spine. The envelope was cream, like the seating cards, and my name was written across the front in Kala's own hand. For one foolish second, I thought it might be a note. An apology, maybe, or a thank you for everything I'd quietly done. Instead, it was an itemized invoice. The full remaining balance for the wedding, printed in neat columns, the venue upgrades I'd never approved, the imported florals I'd never chosen, the Aldridge approved menu with the wine list that cost more than my first car. At the bottom, a total that made my breath go still. And across the top, in my daughter's looping script, 3 words that I will carry to the end of my days: your contribution, Mom. Kala explained it lightly, almost cheerfully, as though she were doing me a kindness by including me. Vivian, she added, had mentioned that the bride's mother traditionally handles the costs. I held that piece of paper and felt something in me go very quiet and very clear. I recognized line items I had explicitly declined. I recognized the loan-funded grandeur I was now being billed to cover. I did not argue. I did not cry. I simply folded the invoice along its crease, slid it back into its envelope, and asked my daughter for one evening to review it properly. She seemed almost relieved. She thought I was going to pay. That night I drove to the one office still lit at that hour. Mr. Okafor had handled Tom's estate years ago, and he had handled our trust ever since. A careful, unhurried man who never said in 10 words what he could say more precisely in 6. I laid everything on his desk: the master contract, the vendor agreements, the deposit records, the Aldridge's contribution paragraph, and the invoice. He read it all twice. Then he set down his glasses and confirmed, in that even voice of his, exactly what I had already pieced together at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning. The venue contract was in my name. Every vendor agreement was in my name. Every deposit had come from me, outright and final. The Aldridge contribution was a conditional loan, repayable by the couple, dressed up as generosity. And the family trust, the one Kala assumed she would simply inherit, the one Vivian had no idea even existed, vested only on terms I controlled, and I alone. I had walked in feeling cornered. I walked out understanding something that steadied me to the bone. I was not trapped in this wedding. I was the foundation under it. Everything they had built on me. I did not make a scene. Scenes are for people without paperwork. Instead, the next morning, I replied in writing, calm, courteous, and final. I addressed it to both Calla and Vivian, and I copied Danny and the lead vendors, because I had learned my lesson about who needs to see things in writing. I thanked them for the invoice. I clarified, gently, that the wedding I had funded so far had been a gift, freely given and therefore not a debt anyone could bill me for. And then I noted, just as gently, that since the celebration was being publicly credited to the Aldridge family at every turn, the photos, the announcements, the front row reserved for the people who built something, it seemed only right that the Aldridge family assume its remaining costs. I authorized no further transfers. I made no threats. I simply stopped being the silent account behind the curtain. 3 short paragraphs. I read them once, and I sent them, and then I made myself a cup of tea and let the morning be quiet. The math stopped working almost immediately. Because the vendors were contracted to me, every one of them paused the moment my instruction reached them, politely, professionally, pending new payment authorization. The florist called the estate. The caterer called Vivian. The venue coordinator, who had only ever taken direction from my signature, suddenly had no one solvent to take direction from. And the Aldridges, who had spent the whole season performing wealth they were quietly borrowing, now had to produce real money in a matter of days. Money their loan, funded image could not absorb. Vivian's calls to me started sharp, then turned brittle, then frightened, in that order. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, my daughter finally understood the thing I had understood at 2 a.m. The family she had placed in the front row, the people she had cropped me out of the photo for. They could not actually pay for the front row. They never could. The whole magnificent day had been standing on the woman in row 9. And that was when Vivian decided to drive out to the lake house and tell me, to my face, exactly what she thought of me. Vivian arrived at the lake house in a car that cost more than the house did, though by then I understood that the car, like everything else, was probably leased. She came in without quite being invited, took one look at my modest kitchen, and tried charm first. The practiced smile, the talk of family, and tradition, and what's best for the children. When that earned her nothing, the smile thinned into something truer. She told me I was ruining the wedding. She told me I was embarrassing both families, that people were talking, that a woman of my background couldn't possibly understand the obligations that came with a name like theirs. She implied, without quite saying it, that I was a small and bitter woman taking petty revenge on her own daughter's happiness. I let her finish. I have learned that people will always tell you exactly who they are if you simply give them enough silence to fill. And when she was done, I stood, walked to Tom's old drawer, and laid 3 things on the kitchen table in front of her. The contracts, with my name on every line. The loan agreement, with hers. And a printout of that radiant rehearsal photograph, captioned about the family, with me cropped to the edge. I slid them across the wood and asked her, very calmly, which one she'd like to dispute first. She didn't dispute any of them. She couldn't. I watched the whole performance drain out of her face as she understood, finally, that the woman she had seated in row 9 had been reading every document she signed. There was nothing to threaten me with. There was no leverage, no name, no obligation that outranked a signature. She gathered the papers as if she might take them, then thought better of it, then left without another word. And the silence she left behind was the most honest thing she'd offered me all season. Calla came the next evening, alone. She stood in my doorway looking younger than she had in months, and at first she was defensive, arms crossed, chin up, ready for the fight she expected. I didn't give her one. I just set the same documents on the table and told her to read them. And I watched my daughter's face change line by line. She saw that I had paid for everything outright, asking nothing back. She saw that the Aldridge grandeur she'd been so desperate to belong to was borrowed money wearing a borrowed name. She saw that the woman she had placed in the back row, the mother she'd told it's just where you sit, had been quietly holding up the entire day with her own 2 hands. When she looked up, her eyes were wet and her voice was very small. I did not gloat. I had no appetite for it. I asked her only one question, the same one she'd given me at the rehearsal, returned now with its true weight. Tell me, I said. Who, exactly, built something? What came after wasn't an apology for the cameras. It wasn't the kind of sorry people perform when they've been caught. Kala sat down at my kitchen table. The table she'd done her homework at, the table I'd paid every bill at. And she cried the way she had as a child, and she told me the truth. That she had wanted to belong so badly she'd stopped asking what it cost. That she had let strangers tell her which family was worth honoring. That she had traded my dignity for a seating chart and convinced herself it didn't mean anything. I let her say all of it. I didn't rush to soothe her, the way I'd rushed to make everything easy her whole life. Instead I told her, plainly, the thing she most needed to hear, that it had never been about a chair. It was about being made optional, by the one person I had spent my life making feel essential. And for the first time, I watched my daughter understand the difference between being funded and being loved. They are not the same thing. I had blurred that line for her for years, and that was the part I would have to answer for. Then I gave her a choice, not a punishment, a choice. I told her I would still pay for the wedding I had always intended to give her, gladly, with my whole heart. But not as the invisible donor in row 9. As her mother, honored in the open, the front row restored, the credits corrected, and the Aldridge loan settled by the Aldridges themselves. If she and Spencer wanted that, it was hers. And if they preferred the other version, the borrowed grandeur, the cropped photographs, the family that couldn't pay for its own front row, then they were welcome to it, on their own means, without me. I wasn't angry anymore. I simply told her the decision belonged to her now, the way it should have all along, and then I let the quiet do the rest. Kala chose honesty. I want you to know that, before I tell you about the day itself. Because for a while, I genuinely wasn't sure she would, but she did. By the time the wedding morning came, the seating chart had been quietly redone, the vendor credits corrected, and the Aldridges had settled their own loan rather than watch the day collapse in front of everyone they'd spent the season trying to impress. Vivian's smile, when I saw her in the garden, had gone brittle at the edges. The smile of a woman performing a graciousness she no longer felt. And I arrived dressed in the same outfit I'd planned all along, the navy I'd chosen because Tom always said it suited me, and I walked toward a chair that no longer read row 9. I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a small, quiet satisfaction in that. But it wasn't triumph I felt, it was more like the relief of a seam finally pulled straight. The sense that a thing had been put back the way it was always meant to sit. There was no speech. No grand exposure, no scene in front of the guests. I had never wanted one. What happened instead was simpler, and somehow much larger. As the music began and the rows filled, my daughter crossed the garden, in full view of the Aldridge associates, who had once cropped me out of their photograph, and she walked her mother to the front row herself. She took my arm and placed me exactly where I belonged, in the open, where everyone could see. She didn't announce anything. She didn't need to. The gesture said all of it. This is the woman who built something. Maeve was already seated beside me, and she reached over and squeezed my hand, so hard it nearly hurt, and I understood, sitting there in the morning light, that this was the apology that mattered, not the tears at my kitchen table. Those were for her. This was for me, visible, chosen, real. A daughter publicly correcting, in front of the very people she'd tried to impress, the one thing she could never take back in private. I'd be lying, too, if I told you I didn't notice what it cost the other side. In the weeks that followed, the borrowed image the Aldridges had spent so carefully began to crack. Not because I said a word, but because people talk, and money has a way of telling the truth even when its owners won't. The associates who'd praised the family's pedigree grew quieter. The invitations thinned, and my own steadiness, the thing Vivian had mistaken all season for weakness, drew a kind of respect I had never gone looking for. I won't pretend I grieved their losses, but I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters. I felt no real pleasure in watching them fall. The cruelty had never been the point. The point was the truth holding its shape, the simple, clean relief of things being what they actually are, instead of what someone insisted you pretend. And the lesson settled in me as plainly as anything Tom ever taught me at that workbench. People who must be flattered, or paid, or impressed into respecting you were never your family to begin with. They were an audience. And you do not owe an audience the front row of your life. After the vows, in the soft part of the evening when the music had gone gentle and the cake was mostly gone, Kala found me at the edge of the garden. She didn't say much. She just told me, in a voice scrubbed clean of everything Vivian had ever put into it, that she finally saw who had built her life. And I forgave her. I want to be clear about what that means, because I don't think forgiveness is what people imagine. It wasn't erasing what happened, and it wasn't pretending the wound hadn't been real. It was a boundary, set down at last and meant to hold. Love freely given, yes, the way I'd always given it, but never again mistaken for something owed. I would still be her mother. I would still show up in snowstorms. But I had learned at 58 the difference between being generous and being taken, and I was not going to unlearn it for anyone's comfort. Not even hers. Especially not hers. So that's the whole of it. The seat I was banished from, the bill I was handed, and the quiet reply that put everything back where it belonged. I think about that little card sometimes, the one that read row 9, and I almost want to thank it. Because it taught me something I'd somehow reached the back half of my life without ever learning, that the people who truly love you will never need to be reminded where you sit. They'll save you the seat before you ask. Let me leave you with one question tonight, the same one I've been turning over ever since. If you ever found yourself moved quietly to the back of a room you'd built with your own hands, would you spend your energy demanding the front row back? Or would you simply, calmly stop holding up the room? Tell me in the comments. I'll be reading. And whatever you've carried, however long you've carried it quietly, I hope you know you were never the one in the wrong for finally setting it down.